The cold December rain had finally stopped when a jogger's phone call shattered the quiet morning of April 14th, 2003, along the rocky shoreline of San Francisco Bay. A woman's body, missing its head and limbs, had washed ashore near Point Isabel Regional Shoreline in Richmond, California. Just one day earlier, and a mile away, a couple walking their dog had discovered the remains of a male fetus near Brooks Island. For the Modesto Police Department and thousands who had spent nearly 4 months searching, praying, and hoping, the worst fears were about to be confirmed. The victims were 27-year-old Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. This is the story of how the man who reported her missing on Christmas Eve became the man convicted of taking everything she loved away from her, and how a web of lies, a secret mistress, and one fateful fishing trip would unravel to reveal a truth that shook America. Laci Denise Rocha wasn't just another 27-year-old substitute teacher from Modesto. She was the kind of woman who lit up every room she entered, her infectious laugh echoing down school hallways as she worked with elementary students who adored her. Friends remember how she'd spend hours decorating her house on Covenant Avenue, her obsession with Martha Stewart evident in every carefully placed throw pillow and seasonal wreath. Every Saturday morning, Laci would walk her golden retriever, Mackenzie, through the La Loma neighborhood, always stopping to chat with neighbors, always remembering the small details about their lives that made them feel seen. Her mother, Sharon Rocha, recalls a daughter who called her multiple times a day, sharing recipes she wanted to try, or nursery ideas for the baby boy she and her husband Scott had decided to name Connor. Just 2 weeks before Christmas 2002, Laci had hosted a baby shower, her face glowing as she opened tiny outfits and blankets, 8 months pregnant and radiating the joy of impending motherhood. Friends say she'd already started a journal for Connor, writing letters about how much she loved him before he even took his first breath. On December 23, 2002, Laci spent the afternoon at her mother's salon, getting her hair highlighted for the holidays, talking excitedly about the family Christmas Eve dinner she was preparing the next day. That evening, she and Scott watched television together, and Laci ate her favorite snack, peanut butter toast. No one knew those would be her final hours of normalcy. On the morning of December 24th, 2002, at approximately 9:30, according to Scott Peterson's account, he kissed his pregnant wife goodbye and left their modest house on Covina Avenue. The temperature hovered around 40 degrees, unseasonably cold for California's Central Valley, and the sky hung heavy with gray clouds that threatened more rain. Scott told police he'd decided that morning to drive 90 miles to the Berkeley Marina to go fishing in the San Francisco Bay, despite having never fished there before, and despite colder waters and closer fishing spots being available. When he returned home around 4:30 that afternoon, tracking mud through the house from his boots, he found Mackenzie in the backyard, with her leash still attached, wandering alone. Laci was gone. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter. Her car remained in the driveway. The half-prepared breakfast dishes waited in the sink. At 5:17 p.m., Scott called his mother-in-law, Sharon Rocha, his voice strained as he asked if Laci was there. When Sharon arrived at the house 30 minutes later, finding her daughter's belongings but no Laci, the terror began to crystallize. At 5:48 p.m., Sharon called 911, her voice breaking as she reported her pregnant daughter missing. Officer John Evers of the Modesto Police Department arrived at 6:40 p.m., finding Scott freshly showered and remarkably composed for a man whose 8 months pregnant wife had vanished. The December darkness had fully settled over Modesto by then, and somewhere in that cold night, a young mother and her unborn son were already beyond reach. Detective Craig Grogan, a 15-year veteran of the Modesto Police Department, took lead on the case within hours of the missing person report. He'd investigated countless cases, but something about this one felt wrong from the start. As he interviewed Scott Peterson in those first crucial hours, Grogan noted the husband's unusual calmness, the way his eyes never quite filled with the panic that typically consumed family members of the missing. Scott's story about the fishing trip seemed almost rehearsed. He'd purchased a 2-day fishing license on December 20th, just 4 days earlier, despite rarely fishing and never having visited the Berkeley Marina before. When Grogan asked what he'd been fishing for in the bay's cold December waters, Scott's answer was vague. Sturgeon, maybe, or striped bass. But he'd used lures completely inappropriate for either species. The detective began assembling his team, pulling in investigators from the Stanislaus County Sheriff's Department and eventually the FBI. The challenges were immediate and daunting. Laci could have been anywhere within a 100-mile radius, and with each passing hour, the likelihood of finding her alive diminished. The community of Modesto rallied with heartbreaking intensity. Volunteers plastered telephone poles with missing person flyers, showing Laci's radiant smile. Search parties combed Dry Creek Park, where Scott claimed Laci had planned to walk Mackenzie that morning, though no witnesses ever confirmed seeing her. Sharon Rocha appeared on local news, her voice as she pleaded for her daughter's safe return, while Scott stood beside her, his expression difficult to read. What investigators didn't know yet, what they couldn't have imagined, was that Scott Peterson had been living a double life, and the evidence of his deception was about to surface in the most unexpected way. The first major break came on December 30th, just 6 days after Laci's disappearance, when a woman named Amber Fry walked into the Modesto Police Department. The 28-year-old massage therapist from Fresno had a story that would change everything. She'd been dating Scott Peterson since November, she explained, her hands as she spoke to detectives. He'd told her he was unmarried, that he was ready for a serious relationship, that he'd lost his wife, and this would be his first holiday season without her. Amber had believed him completely, until a friend, having seen news coverage of the missing pregnant woman from Modesto, recognized Scott from Amber's description and urged her to contact police. When Detective Grogan showed Amber photographs of Scott with his very much alive and pregnant wife, the blood drained from her face. But Amber Fry made a decision that day that would prove crucial to the investigation. She agreed to record every phone conversation Scott had with her going forward. Over the next several weeks, as Scott publicly pleaded for Laci's return, he was simultaneously calling Amber, sometimes multiple times a day, weaving increasingly elaborate lies. On New Year's Eve, as vigils for Laci were held throughout Modesto, Scott called Amber from a party, music and laughter in the background, claiming he was in Paris celebrating at the Eiffel Tower. The recordings revealed a man capable of compartmentalizing reality in chilling ways, able to discuss romantic futures with one woman while his pregnant wife remained missing. Investigators began piecing together other evidence. Scott had researched San Francisco Bay tides and currents on his computer in early December. He'd purchased a 14-foot aluminum boat just weeks before Laci disappeared, telling his friend he wanted to go fishing, though he'd shown little interest in the hobby before. Neighbors remembered seeing Scott back his boat into his driveway late on December 23rd, the night before Laci vanished, though he'd initially told police he'd kept it at his warehouse. The warehouse itself drew investigators' attention. Scott had secured a lease on the facility in November, paying cash, telling the landlord he needed storage space for his fertilizer sales business. But when detectives searched it, they found very little fertilizer equipment. What they did find was disturbing. Residue that appeared to be cement in the bed of Scott's truck, and reports from his transactions showing he'd purchased 90 pounds of cement mix in December, crafting homemade anchors in his warehouse. Scott claimed these were for his boat, but he could never adequately explain why he needed so many, or why he'd made them himself rather than purchase them. By early January 2003, investigators had identified Scott Peterson as their primary suspect, though they lacked the one piece of evidence they needed most, Laci's body. Without it, building a murder case would be extraordinarily difficult. The circumstantial evidence was mounting, but questions remained. Phone records showed Scott had made several calls to Laci's cell phone after returning home on December 24th. Behavior that could be interpreted as a concerned husband trying to reach his wife, or as a calculated attempt to create an alibi. Forensic teams had combed through the Peterson home, finding no evidence of violence, no blood, no signs of struggle. Scott's story never wavered in those early weeks. He'd been fishing. Laci had been home when he left, and he had no idea what happened to her. But his behavior grew increasingly suspicious. He sold Laci's car within weeks of her disappearance. He appeared at a vigil with bleached blonde hair, later claiming he'd lightened it for work. When journalists pressed him about the affair with Amber Fry, which had become public knowledge by late January, he showed little remorse, calling it a distraction from his marriage troubles. Meanwhile, Amber's recorded conversations revealed a man whose lies were becoming impossible to track. He told her he'd been traveling in Europe, in Mexico, in Maine, all places he'd never actually visited. When Amber, following instructions from detectives, directly asked him if he'd hurt Laci, Scott's answers were evasive, circular. Never quite a denial, but never an admission either. The investigation had become a waiting game, and for Sharon Rocha and her family, each day without answers was an eternity of anguish. Then came April 13, 2003. A couple walking their dog along the San Francisco Bay shoreline near Brooks Island discovered what appeared to be the remains of an infant. The body was badly decomposed, but the measurements suggested a near-term fetus. Investigators rushed to the scene, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what this might mean. The next day, less than 2 miles away at Point Isabel Regional Shoreline, another discovery: the torso of an adult female, also severely decomposed, missing her head, arms, and legs. The currents and marine life had taken their toll during the nearly 4 months in the water, but there was enough. DNA testing would confirm what everyone already feared. The victims were Laci Peterson and her son Connor. They'd been found almost exactly where Scott had claimed to be fishing on December 24, 2002, a location 90 miles from their Modesto home, a spot Scott had allegedly chosen at random on Christmas Eve morning. The statistical probability of this being coincidental was virtually impossible. For investigators, the bodies washing ashore where Scott said he'd been that day was the break they needed. The evidence suddenly crystallized into a narrative that was both devastating and undeniable. Medical examiners determined that the fetus showed signs of having been expelled from the mother's body due to decomposition gases, suggesting Laci had been in the water since late December. The duct tape found on Laci's remains indicated someone had tried to weigh down her body. Detective Grogan coordinated with San Diego authorities, knowing Scott would soon realize the significance of the bodies being found. On April 18, 2003, detectives arrested Scott Peterson in the parking lot of a golf course in San Diego, just 15 miles from the Mexican border. When officers approached his Mercedes, they found a man who'd transformed his appearance, his hair bleached almost white, his beard now a goatee, wearing casual clothes that suggested a man on the move. Inside his car, investigators discovered $15,000 in cash, multiple credit cards, camping equipment, several changes of clothes, and his brother's driver's license. Scott claimed he'd been golfing, but he had no golf clubs. He said the cash was for purchasing a car, but he already owned 2 vehicles. The evidence suggested a man preparing to flee, though Scott's attorney would later argue he was simply visiting his family in San Diego. In the interrogation room, Scott maintained his innocence, his demeanor still remarkably calm given the circumstances. He expressed shock that Laci's body had been found, grief that seemed performative to the detectives who'd been studying his behavior for months. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence, the affair, the boat, the computer searches, the location of the bodies, Scott's explanations became increasingly convoluted. He couldn't account for the homemade anchors he'd made, but claimed to have lost while fishing. He couldn't explain why he'd told Amber Fry on December 9th that he'd lost his wife and would be spending his first holidays without her, 2 weeks before Laci actually disappeared. Most damning, he couldn't provide any reasonable explanation for how his wife and unborn son ended up in the exact location where he claimed to have been fishing on the day they disappeared. As the interrogation continued into the early morning hours, investigators knew they had their man. What Scott Peterson didn't know was that Amber Fry had recorded over 20 hours of their phone conversations, creating an audio record of his lies that would prove devastating at trial. Scott Peterson was charged with 2 counts of murder, first-degree murder for Laci and second-degree murder for Connor. The distinction reflected prosecutors' theory that Laci's death was premeditated, while Connor's death occurred as a result of his mother's murder. The trial began in June 2004 in Redwood City, California, after being moved from Modesto due to extensive pretrial publicity. Lead prosecutor Rick DiStasso methodically built the state's case, knowing he lacked direct evidence of how Laci died or where she was killed. The prosecution's strategy relied on 3 pillars of evidence. First, Scott's behavior before and after Laci's disappearance painted a picture of a man who wanted out of his marriage and impending fatherhood. The affair with Amber Fry demonstrated his desire for a different life. His research into San Francisco Bay currents and his purchase of a boat weeks before Laci vanished showed premeditation. His lies to Amber about having lost his wife before she actually disappeared revealed a consciousness of guilt. Second, the physical evidence, while circumstantial, was damning. The homemade anchors he'd crafted and claimed to have lost while fishing, the cement residue in his truck, the fishing lures inappropriate for the species he claimed to be targeting. Most crucially, the bodies washing ashore precisely where he'd been on December 24th created a link that defense attorneys struggled to explain away. Third, Scott's behavior after Laci's disappearance showed a stunning lack of typical grief responses. He'd sold her car, made contradictory statements to investigators, attempted to flee to Mexico, and continued his romantic relationship with Amber even as he publicly appealed for his wife's safe return. The defense, led by high-profile attorney Mark Garagos, argued that Scott was being railroaded, that the investigation had focused too narrowly on him while ignoring other possibilities. They suggested Laci might have been abducted by someone else, pointing to reported sightings of a pregnant woman in Modesto on December 24th after Scott had left for his fishing trip. They challenged the timeline, questioning whether medical evidence could definitively prove when Laci died. But their arguments couldn't overcome the cumulative weight of the circumstantial evidence. When Amber Fry took the stand in August 2004, the courtroom fell silent. For 8 days, jurors listened to her testimony and the recorded phone calls where Scott's voice dripped with deception. They heard him claim to be at the Eiffel Tower when he was actually at a candlelight vigil for Laci. They heard him plan romantic getaways with Amber while police searched desperately for his missing wife. Amber's composure on the stand, her willingness to cooperate with investigators despite being victimized by Scott's lies, made her a sympathetic and credible witness. The defense's cross-examination did little to diminish her impact. On November 12, 2004, after 7 days of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. The foreman stood, and the courtroom held its collective breath. Guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laci Peterson. Guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Connor Peterson. Sharon Rocha collapsed into the arms of her family, years of anguish releasing in uncontrollable sobs. Scott Peterson showed virtually no emotion, his face frozen in the same impassive expression that had characterized his entire trial. In December 2004, during the penalty phase, the same jury recommended death. Before sentencing, Sharon Rocha delivered a victim impact statement that left few dry eyes in the courtroom. Rising from her seat, she screamed directly at Scott Peterson, her voice raw with grief and rage, describing the daughter she'd lost, the grandson she'd never meet, the holidays that would forever be marked by absence rather than celebration. She spoke of Laci's generosity, her dreams of motherhood, the way she'd decorated the nursery with care and love for a son she'd never hold. She spoke of Connor, the baby boy who'd never taken his first breath, never felt his grandmother's embrace. When Sharon sat down, Scott remained stone-faced. Judge Alfred DeLucci formally sentenced Scott Peterson to death by lethal injection on March 16, 2005, calling the crimes cruel, uncaring, heartless, and callous. Today, Scott Peterson is incarcerated at Mequon State Prison in California, serving life without the possibility of parole after the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence in 2020 due to jury selection issues. He was resentenced to life imprisonment in December 2021. Peterson continues to maintain his innocence, and in 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project took up his case, seeking new DNA testing on evidence they claim could point to another perpetrator. But for those who followed the investigation closely, who heard the recorded phone calls, and saw the mountain of circumstantial evidence, Scott's guilt remains clear. This story, though, isn't ultimately about him. It's about Laci Denise Peterson, who at 27 years old had everything to live for. A career she loved, a family who adored her, and a son she'd already fallen in love with despite never meeting him. Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, has dedicated her life to victims' rights advocacy, working with the Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office to create new protections for families of crime victims. She established a memorial scholarship in Laci's name for students pursuing teaching careers, ensuring her daughter's love of education lives on. Every year on what would have been Connor's birthday, Sharon visits the cemetery where Laci and her grandson are buried together, bringing flowers and speaking to them as if they could hear. Detective Craig Grogan, who spent 16 months pursuing justice for Laci, later reflected that the case taught him that evil doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it wears a charming smile and speaks in measured tones. Sometimes it calmly lies while the whole world watches. This case reminds us that justice, even when delayed, matters deeply to those left behind. It took the determination of dedicated investigators, the courage of a mistress who chose truth over self-preservation, and the persistence of a grieving mother who refused to let her daughter be forgotten. The resolution brought no comfort to Sharon Rocha. Nothing could, but it brought accountability. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence or feeling unsafe in a relationship, resources are available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-799-7233. Laci Peterson's story stands as a reminder that behind every true crime case is a real person whose life mattered, whose dreams mattered, whose absence leaves a permanent hole in the hearts of those who loved them.